Good evening, everybody. I want to just introduce myself. My name is Kathy Witkowicki. I'm the Executive Director of the Mentoring Alliance here in Sonoma Valley, and I am, thank you. I am delighted to see a room full of so many people this evening. It just warms my heart. So I want to just get started, and this is our new speaker series. The Mentoring Alliance is no longer doing our big New Year's Eve event. We decided that we wanted to get out of the gala business, and we wanted to get into a business where we think that this town needs a speaker series. Everybody's driving to Marin. Before I get started, I just want to do a few thank yous. First of all, I want to really thank our speakers this evening, Generals Tony Zinni and Vice Admiral Jody Breckenridge, who are here this evening. They are not being paid to be here this evening, which is so nice. And that's because they're doing this out of their respect for the power of mentoring. So good for you guys. We're so excited to have you here. And they would not be here if it wasn't for Sonoma's Colonel Bucky Peterson, who brought them here. Bucky is also a Marine. He was a close friend of General Zinni and his wife, Debbie. He says they served together in some very interesting hot spots, including Somalia, Saudi Arabia, and Korea. And Bucky is a huge proponent of the Mentoring Alliance, and he is the reason that we have this wonderful speaker here tonight. So thank you, Bucky. I also want to acknowledge American Legion Post 489 of Sonoma for their support this evening. Yeah. They've done all our sponsorship for the night. They've done our flags. They've been our bartenders. So we really appreciate their help tonight. The staff of the Mentoring Alliance are all here. Most of them are over by the wall, but they're all here. Thank you so much. And our volunteer mentors and mentees who are here. I'm going to mention our wine sponsors because I hope you're going to drink some more of it after the event is over. We have Benziger Family Winery, Hughes Family Vineyards, Saxon Brown, Etra, San Giacomo Family Winery, 20 Rose, which is thanks to the Nuss family, and Hooley Cellars, thanks to Jim Gagan and Cornelia Bussey. So thank you to our wine sponsors. And if by chance you don't like wine, we have Lagunitas beer. All right, thanks to Lagunitas. I want to give you a little bit of logistics about how the evening is going to flow. We're going to start out with a short overview of the mentoring program because I have a captive audience and you're not waiting for the band to come back on. So I'm going to take this opportunity for those that don't know to just share a little bit about what it is we do in the Stand By Me mentoring program. We are going to show you a 5-minute video about a special mentor and mentee, and that mentee and mentor will then come up onto the stage. And our mentee will then introduce General Zinni. I just wanted to also say that if you're interested in being part of this event and writing some questions, we did hand out some cards as you walked in and some pens. And during the second half, if you can pass those questions to either end of the row, we will have our staff coming up and down during the second half and collecting any questions on any cards you have. So just raise them, and they'll be in the aisles. And then we'll get them up here, and Jody will ask those questions, and she can't obviously ask all of them, but she'll ask as many as she can so that you can be part of the discussion in the second half. The event will conclude at approximately 8:15. We're going to try. And there will be a cash bar in the dining room that will be open at the end of the evening for those that want to stick around and talk a little bit more about this very timely topic over another glass of wine. Signed copies of the General's latest book are on sale. Readers' Books is out front, and they will be there outside afterwards as well. And they are all signed by General Zinni, and readers will be donating 15% back to the Mentoring Alliance for all their sales tonight. So thank you to Readers' Books. I know many of you are in the room, know about the Mentoring Alliance, but for those of you that are new this evening, I just want to give you a little brief overview. We are in our 19th year of mentoring in Sonoma Valley. It's amazing. We have opportunities for one-on-one mentoring, And we have about 458 children right now matched with 458 mentors just in our little school district right here in Sonoma Valley. But we also are introducing a new opportunity through a grant we got from Impact 100, and that is we're starting group mentoring. So if anyone says, oh, I'd love to mentor, but I travel, or I'm not here all the time, or I don't know if I could do this on my own, I feel like I need support, talk to me or talk to any of our staff, because we are starting group mentoring in an effort to get some of our kids on the waiting list to be matched with mentors. So we have 153 children who are waiting for a mentor. So the time is right. It's the beginning of the school year, and it's the perfect time to think about mentoring. We have lots and lots of boys in our program, and a lot of them live in fatherless homes. And we're really, this will resonate with some of the Marines, but we're looking for a few good mentors, because we have so many boys who could really use that in their life. I would like to introduce you to one such boy this evening, and we're going to show his story, and it's a short 5-minute video. I just want to let you see one of the relationships that we have in our program.
Genaro's father left shortly after he was born. So he's been raised by his mother. And I know there's always this feeling of there must be something wrong with me, otherwise I wouldn't have been given away. His mother told me one time that as they were arguing with the father, he said that she wasn't a good mother, couldn't be a good mother, and that Genaro as a result was not going to turn out to be worth anything. She took that as a personal challenge.
Genaro not having his dad, having Jan as a male model has made a big difference in my life and Genaro's life. You know, Genaro sees him as not only his mentor, but his friend.
I can trust him with everything, with family stuff, school stuff, friends stuff, social stuff, and all that. He helps me and teaches me at the same time. And so, but at the same time, I can become friends with him. I could joke with him, I can tell him stories and everything like that.
Well, I told him, I said, there's nothing we can't talk about.
True.
If you want to talk about it.
Right.
And he knows if he asks me a question, he's going to get a long answer. It's really worked out well. I mean, I can see myself being matched with a lot of different other kinds of young men that they wouldn't have any interest in what I'm interested in. He's always got good grades. I think he's quite a smart young boy. He was Student of the Year. And so our relationship has been much more intellectual in that sense. I think it is a matter of just responding to the needs that you see. Much better than it was a few years ago.
Oh, yeah.
The Mentoring Alliance donated or paid for my lessons for a few years, which I'm really grateful for. And as I progressed in the years, I really enjoyed it, and I kept playing it.
I've been encouraging him to learn to play the piano. It's something I wished I had learned to do, and he's got a good teacher, and he practices, and he's not wasting his time.
He's a very smart kid, and you know, we have Jan to push him to do well and to do better, and always try to do the best.
I didn't spend as much time with my own sons as I would have liked to. And as looking back on it, I probably wouldn't think of myself as one of the best fathers in the world as a result of that. And you know, it takes a while to grow up and mature and be in a position where you feel like you're really ready to give something back. So all of those considerations, I think, helped motivate me a little bit in wanting to do something with Admiral.
you guys come up. That film was produced by Mike Abella, which is a high school graduate of the film class at Sonoma Valley High School. Our stars for the evening here. All right, great. This is Hanaro and Jan. We have a little token of appreciation for the two of you to go out together, and Hanaro will introduce General Zinni.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am very proud that tonight I get to introduce two very distinguished Americans. Vice Admiral Jody Breckenridge is a former commander of the U.S. Coast Guard Pacific Area and one of the only 4 female Coast Guard flag officers. She was responsible for overseeing the operation of all missions that took place across 73 million square miles throughout the Pacific Basin all the way to the Far East. This evening, she will be interviewing General Tony Zinni. General Zinni is a 4-star general, now retired from the U.S. Marine Corps. He is one of the most respected and outspoken military leaders of the past 2 decades and has recently been featured on 60 Minutes, C-SPAN, Meet the Press, and Fox News. He is a former commander-in-chief of the United States Central Command, where he was in charge of all American troops in the Middle East. Following his retirement from the Marine Corps, the Bush administration thought so highly of him that he was appointed to one of its highest diplomatic posts, Special Envoy to the Middle East. In 2008, he was one of several candidates who was considered as a vice presidential running mate for Barack Obama. He has written 4 books. Tonight, he will discuss his latest book entitled Before the First Shots Are Fired: How America Can Win or Lose Off the Battlefield. General Zinni, as your troops say, the Marines have landed and the situation is well in hand. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Vice Admiral Jody Breckenridge of the United States Coast Guard and 4-star General Tony Zinni of the United States Marines.
Great job. Awesome job. You did really well. Well, first, on behalf of General Zinni and myself, I want to thank Kathy and the Mentoring Alliance, as well as all of Sonoma, all of you who showed up here tonight, for having us here. So, General, I know that there are lots of burning questions out in the audience, particularly with what's been in the news all week. Your book couldn't have come at a more relevant time. So before we get to those questions, I want to lay a little bit of groundwork to make sure that we all have the same context as we go through this discussion. So it seemed as you were reflecting back and writing this book, you basically came to this book from 3 different perspectives. First, your military career. Secondly, as the CEO of a global business. And then thirdly, as in your post-retirement days, as a special envoy or working with international mediation and negotiation companies. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it is. I've always felt that ever since the end of the Cold War, that we didn't have a grasp on the kind of changing world we're in, and really didn't understand what America's role was in that world. I thought we suddenly hit a point where we stopped thinking strategically, and we began to rely too much on our military. We had an over-militarized foreign policy. We committed our military all over the world without a clear idea of what we wanted them to do, a strategy, a political set of objectives. And I began to see that we lost the ability that we maybe had when we had the George Marshalls and the George Kennans and the way we thoughtfully did things in the past. And I began to realize that the confusion was not on the battlefield, but off the battlefield. And we were not grasping, obviously, all the things that have to happen before we put our troops in harm's way, and all the things that have to happen to sustain them and lead them toward success. Let me say one other thing since we're starting this off, and I want to say something about Kathy and her effort here. this moves my heart. Kathy came down to the Marines Memorial to talk to me about tonight, and she described this program, and I was completely taken by it. As somebody said, she's a force of nature. I say she's a force of nature for good, and I'm really moved by Sonoma and the support for this program, and I think she is a jewel and a treasure for this community.
So following up that intro, if I can take you back to your early days in Vietnam, where it seems like this perspective that you got a foundational understanding through that experience as a junior officer. Could you talk to us a little bit about the lessons learned that you walked away from Vietnam with, some of which seem very different than your peer group?
As a young lieutenant, I was assigned to be an advisor to the Vietnamese Marines. And we worked things a little differently then. I was sent off to Army Special Warfare School to learn about insurgency and communist-inspired insurgency and a lot of the doctrine, philosophy. I also went to Vietnamese language training. And we ended up with the Vietnamese Marines. There were only 2 of us to a battalion. We wore their uniforms. We spoke their language. We operated all over the country, and they had a quartering act. So when we operated in villages and places, we actually moved into the houses with the people. And so I spent my first tour of duty as a young, impressionable lieutenant really amongst the Vietnamese people. I rarely saw another American. And so when I came back from that first tour, I would go back a second time. I would meet up with my classmates and fellow lieutenants that had been in U.S. units. And when we would talk about the war, their version of the war was totally different than mine. What I saw from the perspective of the people of Vietnam was entirely different. And it really shaped my thoughts about how we engage in these kinds of conflicts, the importance of cultural context, understanding the war at levels that are much deeper than we may believe when we get involved or where we set our objectives. And that kind of shaped my perspective for the rest of my career.
Could you talk a little bit about what you learned about end states and what it took to understand those cultural differences?
I mentioned in the book a story. We were operating in the northern part of South Vietnam, and we had moved into this village. And I ended up in the house of the village chief. And about this time in the evening, the village chief's wife had fixed us a dinner, and we were outside eating the dinner, and she said to me, "Do you have a picture of your family and your home?" I had just been married before I left, and I had a picture of my wife and I in front of my father-in-law's house, and she looked at it and she said, "Why are you here?" This was a mud hut, too, believe me. And I said to her, "Well, you know, we're going to bring democracy, free market economy." I had the spiel down pretty good. And she looked at me and she said, "What are you going to do about the situation there?" And she pointed toward the south. And I pointed toward the north and said, "You mean there?" She said, "No." She said, "What do you want me to die for?" She said, those people in Saigon that run our government, one general after another committing coups, it's a corrupt government. You, the greatest power in the world, the United States, are here to give us something. But when I look at what we have there that you seem to accept, I'm worried about what you want my sons to fight for and die for here. And that really meant something to me. It hit home that we can't want it more than they want it. And if we get involved, they have to have something they understand that they should fight and die for. You can see that situation in Iraq today. Because the Maliki government wasn't inclusive, the Sunnis didn't have something, or the Kurds didn't have something to fight and die for that was Iraq. The Karzai government didn't give the Afghans something to die for. And so we haven't learned that lesson. I think we forgot something from World War II. World War II was remarkable in many ways, but the aftermath was more remarkable. We, for the first time in the history of the world, the winner of the war paid reparations. The Marshall Plan cost the United States taxpayer a lot of money, Only 19% were in favor of it when it was first proposed, until George Marshall gave 80-some speeches and convinced people it was the right thing to do. We would stop the chronic wars and fighting in Europe. We would rebuild Japan and Germany. We would commit to having the kind of government, the kind of political system that people could fight and die for, and we can see the results today. We seem to have forgotten that. If we're going to get involved, if we're going to get into the business of nation building, which is arguable whether we should or not and where we should choose to do it, we better realize that it isn't just a matter of us showing up with guns and fighting off a potential enemy. It's what you leave behind. And I think we've gotten that wrong in a lot of times and didn't really understand what we've had to put in place.
So let's take some of those pieces that made the Marshall Plan successful and break them down a little bit, perhaps. You talk about the succession of the wars, the 5 formally declared wars in our nation's history, and the progression of what the view of the role of the United States was. Do we know what our role in today's world is?
I don't think we know yet. I don't, we clearly knew what it was coming out of the Second World War and through the period of the Cold War. We were the leader of the free world. We understood that responsibility. I would argue the most remarkable period in our history was the period immediately after the Second World War, from 1945 to 1950. I mentioned the Marshall Plan, but the 1947 National Security Act, we restructured our government to meet a new and different world. We created the National Security Council, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We revamped government in a major way. And as a point, that was the last time we've ever done it, and it's long overdue. We also created the International Monetary Fund, the World Banks. We created NATO, a military alliance that withstood and deterred and contained the Soviet Union and other threats for half a century. It was a remarkable time. The most remarkable part of all that was who did it. A Democratic administration under Harry Truman, a Republican Congress, both House and Senate, led by people like Vandenberg, an apolitical general named George Marshall, probably one of our greatest, if not the greatest, strategic thinker. We actually could work across political lines. We could actually see the benefits to our nation, understand our place in the world, how to deter the threats that threatened our very existence, and able to do it and put politics aside. I would hope our Congress and others might look back to then, and we're talking about mentors tonight, they might channel back to those members that were Republican, Democrat, and just honest 5-star generals, and maybe draw a lesson from all that.
We also have a very deliberate planning process in this country that we invest a lot of time and effort, at least within the services, and it starts with a national security strategy and cascades down, not just to DOD, but across all of government and out to the combatant commanders, all of whom develop plans. And those plans are still alive today and so forth. But is the system broken?
The system's broken in this sense. The military is a crazy planning institution. We plan everything. We have a plan for everything. We teach a planning process that's very structured. And so on that end of the business, our education system, our planning processes are very much structured in a way to delve into the detail. President and General Eisenhower said, it's not the plan, it's the planning. The planning is your education. It's how you understand the world. It's how you come up with the options and the way to deal with it. It's how you understand what your capabilities are or maybe are not. But the point that where it's broken is we have a first principle that is important for us. Every military person I know subscribes to this heart and soul, and that is civilian leadership and control of the military. It is gospel to us. Every time someone is stretched against that, whether it was MacArthur in Korea, Singlaub in Korea, or even lately General McChrystal, unfortunately, the president came down and made a decision that went beyond. And I never met a military person that didn't understand that. But with the control by the civilian leadership and political leadership of the military comes an obligation in my mind that you know what the hell you're doing. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to get us into the messes that we've seen recently. I started out to write this book about what the troops face on the ground and how these new conflicts, maybe ever since the Vietnam War, maybe even before, are very confusing. And I thought from the troops' perspective, we could better understand what goes on. I went to Afghanistan and Iraq and actually patrolled with the troops and, and obviously experienced Vietnam, Somalia, and other conflicts on my own. I found out that it wasn't the troops. They get it. At the village level, they figure it out. It was much higher than that. It was either the senior military leadership or definitely the political leadership that really don't understand the need to analyze what you're in, understand what you can and can't do, set a strategy to win the battle of the narrative, the messaging, because you have audiences that go out to our allies, to the American people, and even to the potential enemy. We have seemed to bumble and stumble through all this. Senator Goldwater and Representative Nichols, back in the mid-'80s, passed a law and got it through Congress, the Goldwater-Nichols Act. Most people think this just required the military to become more joint and cooperation between the services. But there was another part of that law. It required the President of the United States to send to Congress within the first 150 days of the President's administration a national security strategy, and then to follow that up every year with the submission of the budget. Few presidents have ever met the 150-day requirement. Few ever update what they produce. What they produce is very weak. It doesn't really say anything. I defy you to identify a congressman or a senator who's ever read it. The purpose of it was so that the discussion about what our representatives in Washington would fund and support would be based on a strategic dialogue, that the president would express how he sees the threats, what he sees our role is, what kind of military we can afford, where we should take risks and where we need to invest, what parts of the world are maybe more important, and that isn't done. So the discussion in Congress as to what kind of military you're going to have is based on pork. It's based on, do you build it in my district? There is no strategic dialogue like maybe we had back in the 50s and 60s when our country coming out of World War II was maybe thinking on a grander scale and valued the George Kennans and the George Marshalls and brought in to the administration these kinds of thinkers, especially when they face crisis. That's absent today. Everything is based on politics. There's very little experience in our political leadership in matters of the military, and there's very little interest in learning. Our other elements and parts of government, departments and agencies do not have that same planning culture that the military has. When we go onto a battlefield, the military inherits the whole enchilada. We end up rebuilding governments. We end up doing things like running recreational swimming pools, museums, monitoring date palm harvests, and these are just a few of the things I've seen. The military's running anti-corruption government task forces. People in uniform are not trained to do this. I have a son that's in the Marine Corps. He's done numerous tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's in the infantry. He was in the battle for Marja. He was told as a company commander after they took Marja that he would be the battalion's non-kinetic officer. I asked him, what the hell does that mean? He said, well, I'm supposed to work with the village chiefs and the tribal chiefs on issues of agriculture and other things. And I said, well, the last time I checked, you majored in football in college. What do you know about this? And he says, nothing, but that's what the mission I've been given. But that's exactly what I saw on the ground, that we have our troops doing things, trying to rebuild nations, and we don't have the whole of government present. We don't invest in our other agencies of government, in the people and the resources, in the cooperative planning culture. You can go to any combatant commander. I was a combatant commander. A combatant commander, it comes in two flavors. One is a functional commander, like Special Operations Command or Transportation Command. The other are regional commanders, the Pacific Command, the European Command, Central Command, which I commanded. We have an array of war plans. We have a war plan for everything. You know, no part of that war plan talks about what comes after the fighting. I was a student at the National War College as a lieutenant colonel. We had a representative come speak to us from Congress. His name was Newt Gingrich. And Newt said to us, someday some of you are going to be wearing many stars on your shoulders, and your political masters will come to you and say, do this. We'll direct a military action. You must go to them and say, and then what? And that and then what question is what I don't think our political leaders ask or think through often enough. And that's why we find ourselves in the kinds of messes we've been in lately.
So could you talk a little bit more, as you looked back through some of the past conflicts and the past presidents, you found that each of them had a different approach to their inner circle and their decision-making process, and came to some conclusions about some key attributes of the presidents and that decision-making process. And could you share that with us?
Yeah, when I started the front part of this book, I talked about, you know, the triggering events. What happened to all of a sudden make us consider using military force? Then how did the president gather the intelligence, the information, go through the analysis, and receive advice? What was the mechanism that president had in place? And it varied. You had presidents like Eisenhower, who when they first came into office created a body. He met with John Foster Dulles, his Secretary of State, and said, I want to create a group of thinkers that are not thinkers in a sense that they all agree. I want differing views, but smart people, people like George Kennan and some others. And he said, I want to have them on call. When we face a crisis, I want to call them in, and I want to hear them debate and discuss the issues. This was, he engaged Dulles in a place in the White House called the Solarium room, and it became called the Solarium Group. And when Eisenhower called the group together when he faced a crisis, the issues were laid out before them. Many of them were in government and certainly knew the issues. Some were not in government. But he allowed them to debate. He wouldn't even question them. He didn't even make a comment because he didn't want to influence their thinking. He didn't want to get to the place where maybe they were trying to read the president and what he wanted to do. He wanted to hear open debate, dialogue, and a broad set of options. That was one way things are done. We've had presidents that rely on individuals, whether it's a Kissinger or a Brzezinski, you know, whether it's a Donald Rumsfeld or a Dick Cheney. We have others that aren't interested in too much dialogue. They pretty much get set in what they want to do, and we don't have the debate or maybe even the discussion of alternatives. I had a diplomat friend of mine that said, the president has a great array of options, ranging from a strong letter of protest to a 10-kiloton nuclear airburst. And somewhere in there, he's got to find the right option, or maybe a combination of options. And if he doesn't get the full array of what they might be and understand the advantages and disadvantages, then we're going to be in trouble. Because his mindset, his emotional state, the pressures are on him, what his inclination is to do, will all get him channeled maybe on a path that isn't the best for what we need to do. When I took command of the U.S. Central Command, I had an Army two-star general who was my director of intelligence. And one day, I called him in after I'd just taken over, and I asked him a question. I said, Bob, give me the answer to this question. He said, you know, sir, before I give you the answer, could you tell me what you're going to do with that answer? He said, because I'm not sure that the answer, even though I could give it to you, may be right for what you face. If I don't understand what the basis is, what the question is, what the problem is, how this will play into your decision, there might be a better answer out there that I can't give you. And that hit home to me. I thought about presidents that maybe should understand that, to say to the people that are giving them advice, presenting them with the intelligence, should say, am I asking the right questions? You know, is there something I'm missing? I told a little story going around about the beginning of the Iraq intervention by President Bush, this last one. And I was sitting in the United Arab Emirates, and I was watching TV, and President Bush was explaining why we were going into Iraq. And I'm sort of paraphrasing him. He said, well, this is about the forces of democracy and freedom against the forces of evil, dictatorship, authoritarian regime. And one of the Arabs sitting next to me, watching TV, elbowed me, and he said, this is about Persians versus Arabs. You're about to unleash a devil that we tried to contain for centuries. And the Arab on the other side of me nudged me, and he said, this is also about Sunni versus Shia. You're going to unleash a religious war if you do this. When I thought about that, I thought, who's right, who's wrong? They're all right. You know, the president was right in how he saw the picture, but did he really understand those other two layers and consequences? Today, we can see that those Arab friends of mine sitting with me were absolutely right in what happened with Iranian influence, Persian influence, if you will, and how it gained because of our incursion into Iraq, about how this Sunni-Shia war now is metastasized and has many forms and is spread throughout the region, even beyond the region into Africa and elsewhere. So understanding the context, the culture, the third and fourth order and fifth order effects is critical. It goes back to that point, the and then what? To understand when you go in, it may not be as simple as you think it may be. And if you look at it from your own Western prism, your own cultural biases, you will never get the complexity and the complicated layers that exist, especially in that part of the world that I've been involved in for the last 25 years or more.
So, we have a couple of questions about the viability of NATO and the UN, and I will expand that to include coalition building. Perhaps if we could use the example of the Ukraine. And as we looked at the Ukraine, was Russia's reaction to the Ukraine predictable?
Yes. First of all, I was in the European Command when the wall came down. And at that time, the Secretary of State, James Baker, and the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and Commander of European Command, Jack Galvin, Army four-star general, who I thought were brilliant strategic thinkers, both said that what is critical now with this wall coming down is not making the Russians and others on the other side feel this was a win-lose. We've got to connect to the Russians right away and ensure they understand everybody won on this. Although communism is gone, now we will work to demonstrate how democracy will benefit everyone. And they took several steps. General Galvin sent a number of us NATO generals over into Russia to work with the Russian military. Our mission was to explain how militaries function in a democracy. The Russian military was very open to that from the top, from Marshal Shapasnikov, the senior military leader in the Russian military. We worked at conferences, we worked on discussions about how we function and what the differences are. Baker also formed a task force under Ambassador Rich Armitage to connect to the Russians on economic and political issues, and I actually was part of that task force as well. We spent time working with them on trying to convince them to make the ruble a convertible currency, to work on understanding international auditing and other procedures, to blend them in. Armitage was also tasked with trying to get the Europeans and others to form some sort of maybe Marshall Plan, a new kind of Marshall Plan, not exactly like the past one that helped devastated enemies, but one that sort of worked on these issues, economic, political, and others, to maybe bring the Russians in and find common ground. All those efforts died away. The next thing that happened after the force behind that went away, we suddenly reached out to the former Warsaw Pact countries, and we dumped them into NATO. We went from 16 countries to 28. They didn't have to meet military requirements. The percentage of the GNP that they provided for their defense and military was not held. They were not held accountable to that. They didn't meet the NATO standards. And so all of a sudden, we turned NATO from a military alliance to a weak political alliance. And those Warsaw Pact countries that we pulled away from the Soviet Union was almost an in-your-face. And despite the fact that, even when President Clinton came into office, he signed an agreement with Yeltsin preserving the sovereignty of the Ukraine, and Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons for that. All of a sudden, we forgot about all that. We created this sense of bitterness and nationalism in Russia that allowed somebody like Putin, who's a throwback, to come back into power. They feel we sort of rubbed it into their face, even when we didn't even know what NATO was supposed to do. NATO is still undefined in its mission and its role. We just saw in Cardiff in Wales this last conference where we tried to get NATO to stand up in some way to the crisis in Ukraine and the crisis with ISIS. We got nothing. We got 9 countries that sort of said they might support. Right. Actually, the one country that really stood up was France and is now running airstrikes. But where are the other 27 or 26, not counting us? And so I think what Putin is doing in the Ukraine, he's doing 2 things. One, he is testing American leadership in NATO and in Europe. Is it still there? And the second thing, and most important thing, is European solidarity, European resolve, and European cohesion still there? Is NATO still viable? Will the European Union stand up and actually put hard sanctions on Russia if they don't find some way of resolving the Ukraine crisis? He will push that as far as he can. And right now, he probably senses weakness on both those issues and will continue to push it. Unless there's a strong stance, there's no military solution to the Ukraine, but we should demonstrate the solidarity of NATO, that we're committed to this military alliance. We should also demonstrate that if it's necessary to put harder sanctions, the Europeans and the United States and others are committed to do that, despite the consequences, which could be serious in terms of the economic consequences and energy dependence that Europe has on Russia, with Russia. But absent that, he will push this as far as he can. If he is willing to back down and he sees that, the next part of the equation is some deft diplomacy, which has been absent in our government for 25 years, where we should help find a resolution where nobody loses face on this. Because I don't think Putin will stand for a solution where he is seen as a loser, because he'll lose his own political constituency, and that's just not in his makeup, in his ex-KGB mentality.
So do you think he's likely to accept the Ukrainian concessions that they've offered up this week?
I don't think he'll accept anything unless he knows the Europeans and the Americans will stand firm in a commitment to put sanctions that will hurt in place and stand together on it and not show any breaking in the alliance and in the collective willingness to do that.
And if we make it through the Ukraine, is it the next former European or Eastern
I
European
think
nation?
if he senses weakness, you may see the next test in the Balkans. You may see the next test in Central Asia, although many of the Central Asian countries now are trying to straddle the fence. When the Soviet Union broke up, they immediately rushed to the West. They weren't satisfied with what they received or thought they would receive. Expectations, I think, exceeded what we were willing and others were willing to provide to them. Russia is the bear that sits right on top of them, and so they become more accommodating. There's one historical point that I think is important to understand here. The Russians are paranoid about having buffer states around them. And just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that somebody's not out to get you. And, they have a long memory stretching from Napoleon to the First World War to the Second World War, and even back to the British Empire, the Raj in India, when they were threatened on their eastern and on their western and on their southern flanks. And so that paranoia has existed for centuries. And when the states around them are moving in a direction away from them, or at least out of neutrality, that resurrects in their hearts some ancient fears and again, paranoia that they have. So you need to take that all into consideration when you're trying to understand where their mindset is.
Are you willing to lead the delegation that's going to go deal with the Russians?
I don't think this administration is going to call on me for anything.
Well, most of our questions surround the current situation with ISIS and the Middle East. So first of all, was this predictable?
I don't think it was predictable in the sense that the rapid rise of ISIS to replace al-Qaeda to become the dominant radical Islamic force in the region, or maybe on the globe, was necessarily predictable because it was such a rapid rise. But what was predictable, when they burst into Iraq and took over major parts of Iraq and arrived at the gates of Baghdad, this is almost 4 months ago. We should have paid attention and done something about it then. It gets harder over time. You know, we waited 3+ months to decide we don't have a strategy, and we waited until they attempted to commit genocide, and probably have in some cases. We waited until they crucified people. We waited until they beheaded and butchered people. We waited until they took women and children and sold them off and gave them to their soldiers, even girls as young as 12, 13 years old. And we sat back and watched this. We watched the Iraqi military disintegrate. The poor Kurdish Peshmerga that were outgunned because Iraq wouldn't let them have weapons and that could withstand this. And the moderate Syrian resistance, who's busy fighting Assad and not worried right now about ISIS. And now we've decided to do something. And if somebody can figure out what the strategy is, I'm willing to stay around so you can explain it to me, because I don't understand it.
Well, Secretary Kerry attempted to do that in his testimony earlier this week, saying that in fact there is a strategy, and that strategy is to dismember ISIS just as we did al-Qaeda. So do we have a methodology to achieve that strategy?
Well, listen to what we've heard. We've heard the president say, we will degrade and destroy ISIS. We heard the vice president say, we will follow them to the gates of hell, which are probably in Syria. We heard the president say that we will lead this effort. Then we heard him say, but there's no combat mission for us in this. Now, take those 3 comments, the first 3, then tell me that there's not a combat mission. You want me to destroy ISIS. You want me to follow them to the gates of hell to ensure their destruction. You want me to lead this effort. Some American general and some headquarters, I assume CENTCOM, is leading the effort and drawing their sword. But we have no combat mission in this. If you can explain that to this poor military mind, I'd love to hear it, because I don't get it.
So if we can continue on that thread, also in the news this week, General Dempsey was up on the Hill talking about combat troops not being off the table for a discussion point, followed by an announcement from the White House that ground troops are not going to be utilized, followed by Secretary Kerry going up and talking about our strategy and there being a role for, not being a role for Iran and Syria, and then today that there is a role for Iran. So what's happening to the battle for the narrative and the American public understanding what this is all about?
Well, it's probably akin to the rollout of Obamacare. I mean, it is confusing. There's mixed messages. The president's cabinet, they're not all aligned in some way. I think General Dempsey, said in an honest way that if the situation were to change, he might change his recommendation and even recommend that we put ground forces in, which I think we should have done, by the way, from the beginning, and I can tell you why. This would have been over by now. But that was an honest response. And he paid a price for it. What the general meant to say is what came out of the White House. And so it's unfortunate that we have these disconnections. You have to win the battle of the narrative. We know the fireside chats. We know the great communicator who was president, Ronald Reagan. We know that we've had the bully pulpit of the presidency, which sometimes has, in the face of hard choices, not necessarily with American support, have to go out and build that. The president has a number of audiences. He has the American people. He has potential allies and coalition partners. He even has the enemy. And he has got to get that message straight. If he looks weak to the enemy, if he looks confusing to the American people, if he doesn't look committed to the allies, this isn't all going to come together. The battle of the narrative is as important as the battle where we exchange fire on the battlefield. And it's part of what I tried to say in the book. You've got to get that right. We are not doing a good job, and I would say we haven't done a good job for the past several administrations, whether they're Republican or Democrat. By the way, I am neither, so pox on both their houses, you know. And, but that is critically important. You know, I was talking to a member of the cabinet of Ronald Reagan, and we were talking about Grenada. And he faced a situation much like President Obama faced. He just had the massacre of the Marine barracks in Beirut. And the American people were tired of commitments. They didn't understand the strategy. We left our troops hanging out. There was no political direction, and they were not interested. And this was more closely in terms of time to Vietnam, and they were not interested in any more military adventures. His cabinet recommended to the president, do not go into Grenada. It would be a political disaster for you, Mr. President. They were unanimous on this. And the president said, I just have one question. Is there any possibility that American lives could be at risk? And the intelligence, director of the Central Intelligence who was there said, sir, there is a possibility that some American medical students could be at harm's way. And President Reagan said, then there is no question, we're going. He didn't raise his finger to try to test the political winds. He made a hard choice that we expect of our president to protect the lives of Americans, to protect our interests, and to protect our values.
So given where we are today, one of the questions said, if your advice was sought by the administration, what would you tell them they need to do to approach this challenge with ISIS?
You know, there's an old saying in the North, always shoot the wolf on the sled first, then worry about the ones in the woodline later. You have a wolf on the sled. That's ISIS in Iraq. My advice would be, we got to get them out, and we got to get them right away. 2 brigades of United States soldiers and Marines would end this thing in less than a week on the ground. This sort of pickup team of a Renan army with a little bit of Kurds, a little bit of Iraqi military that folded, this questionable Syrian opposition that we don't even know who they are, that we're going to give them arms and God knows where they'll go to. And by the way, they've got another war on their hands against Assad. That kind of Renan army approach, Mr. President, is very risky. We tried that in Afghanistan with the Northern Alliance. Remember when we had the Special Forces guy was riding horses with him, and we were praising the fact that we don't need to commit a lot of ground troops, and Al-Qaeda got away. We missed them at Tora Bora. The Renan army sold out on us. Get them out. And if it takes American ground troops, get them out. And pound them in Syria as much as you can. These are evil people that will bring that kind of evil to our shores, to our Americans who are overseas. How many beheadings before you buy into it? The next American tourist gets swept off the streets of Cairo somewhere, finds himself in Syria and Iraq, and is on a video and TV. How much of that can we stand? How much can we stand of them trying to wipe out people like the Christian Yazidis or the Chaldeans or the Turkomans or the Assyrians? How much are we going to stand them slaughtering Shia and others? They've just now taken a whole series of Kurdish towns again today. You know, and so get them out. The next thing you have to do is lean on that Iraqi government. This is not Vietnam. This is not Afghanistan. This is not the Maliki government. The Riot Act has to be read to them. It's being read to them by the Kurds and others. It has to be more inclusive. It has to share power. It has to share resources so that the Sunnis will then again, as they did when they had the hope that the Maliki government would do this in the Sunni awakening, they will stand up again. That's job number 2, is to do that. Job number 3 is to get a coalition to support this. We are just now talking to the UN, 4 months later. You know, George H.W. Bush sent James Baker to the UN. We had a resolution authorizing the use of force, which allowed us to build 2 coalitions in the first Gulf War, one under General Schwarzkopf and one under Prince Khalid. I would see us doing the same thing, build a Muslim task force, Get a commander. Build a task force of Europeans and others under an American command and control system. Get them to work together. Everybody can have a part in this. Whether they put combat troops on the ground, and they're more likely to do it if we have a UN resolution and we're there too, they can also provide support. The Saudis, the Kuwaitis, and others paid for the Gulf War. The United Arab Emirates and others, very few people realize, have not only fought with us in the Gulf War, sent troops to the Balkans, sent troops to Afghanistan to stand by our side. The Egyptians sent a division to the Gulf War, sent a brigade to Somalia to fight by our side. You know, so when they have the right motivation, the right leadership, have the right team put together, have the cover and authority of the international community under a UN resolution, it makes it easier to put these coalitions together. We've done this backwards. We've gone to them and said, come support us. We don't have a strategy yet. We don't know what you want to do, but sign this blank check. I don't think it's going to happen.
And another piece of this is the latest estimates that I've seen from our military leaders say, as we look at the Syrian component, we're somewhere between 5 months to a year before they expect them to be trained up and ready to go. I haven't seen any estimates on, given the collapse of the Iraqis, what it will take to get them back up. The Kurds certainly have capability, some capability, and will be ready to go. So with that as a background and your prediction, one of the questions is, what is your prediction for the fate of ISIS? On what timeline?
The highest risk here is the ground force. You just described the ground force we're going to take into battle. We're going to lead the effort according to the president, yet everything we're going to do is a support function. Air support, intelligence support, advisors, equipment. And we're going to bank on this collection that you just so aptly described, Jody. You know, the Kurds, who are lightly armed, aren't a very big force. The Iraqis, who have folded like a cheap suit with the first time they made contact. This sort of amorphous Syrian resistance that we don't even really know and can vet, yet we're going to pump a bunch of arms into them. And that's going to be the force to confront ISIS. If you remember during the Iraq War, when the Marines in our Army fought in Anbar province against al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, which is the forerunner to ISIS, that was a brutal battle. The battles in Fallujah, the battles in Ramadi were tough. Why would this be any different? We had air support, we had intelligence support, yet we're asking this sort of pickup team, this Renan Army, to lead the way into this. And I think this is a high-risk strategy in attempting to do it this way, and we may end up with the enemy having more success in embarrassing us and also winning, again, the battle of the narrative if we don't understand what we're getting into. You just saw today that the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Brennan, and Clapper, the head of all the intelligence community, both say they underestimated ISIS and underestimated their will to fight, just like they underestimated the Iraqis' capability. So we have an enemy that is much more maybe capable than we thought going into this.
So I think you've answered this in part, but to make sure we give it a complete answer, one of the questions is, why is ISIS our problem? There's all kinds of rich nations in the Middle East, and why aren't they standing up and taking care of things in their own backyard? And while beheadings are brutal, are Americans actually endangered by ISIS? And then the third part of it is, we have failed in Iraq and Afghanistan, so why is it we think we will now be successful in that part of the world?
Well, I want to focus on ISIS. I mean, there are two parts of that question as to whether you should be rebuilding nations in the Middle East or you should deal with ISIS. Let's take ISIS. How many beheadings before we can't stand it anymore? How many, if they kill and behead American tourists, if they take our diplomats off the streets, if they blow up an embassy, if they radicalize Islamic communities here, the youth, and we end up with bombings here or even beheadings like was attempted in Australia, how much of that are we willing to accept? How much are we willing to accept in the brutalization of innocent people around the world? We stood by in the Holocaust. We stood by in Rwanda and Burundi. We stood by in Cambodia. When I say we, not just the United States, but the free world. And in Cambodia, when the Khmer Rouge brutally committed genocide. Is that what we're all about? I think American interests are not just economic or security. we have a set of values. We're the greatest power on earth, God-given. And I think sometimes we have to stand up to that commitment. It's not nice. Look, I have fought in many conflicts. I've had 3 bullet holes in me, and you could question some of those commitments. But what I saw around this world are situations where I feel our power and might, based on our value system, should be applied just for the pure justice and the protection of innocence. And if we don't hold that dear enough to be willing to exercise our power, it's much like this program of mentoring. Why would you give? Why would you spend your time to do this? So why would we not exercise some of our power to do this? I think that defines who we are.
So one of the questions goes back to our ground troops that were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's an attempt or a question trying to understand the discussion on rules of engagement and understand why the media and the discussion of how the rules of engagement bound the hands of our troops in the Middle East and why that was.
I think that we got carried away on the rules of engagement in an attempt, obviously, I think in a sincere attempt to minimize collateral damage. And we didn't understand in the process, we weren't actually minimizing collateral damage. And in many cases, we were putting our troops at greater risk. Let me give you an example. And I'll give you an example from my son's unit. They were not allowed to clear indirect fire. This is artillery or mortar fire that comes down on a potential enemy that you're engaging in firing. That had to be cleared 3 and 4 levels above what we normally do. We normally have agencies within the battalion, fire support control centers that can do that clearly. Look at potential civilian casualties, look at restricted targets. We know how to do that. They were allowed, however, to use all their direct fire weapons. So if an enemy is here and you're calling indirect fire right on here and you're limited in your ability to do that, yet you can shoot direct fire, which is going to go way past it and God knows where, the rules of engagement made no sense. In an attempt to minimize collateral damage, people that don't know anything about war fighting and understand what happens on the ground, we are, beyond a doubt, the greatest nation in attempting to limit collateral damage. We have to give every target list to our staff judge advocates to ensure they comply with the just war theory. Are they proportionate in terms of what we need to do? Do they endanger innocence? Are there restricted targets, significant sites that might represent historical or religious values? Now, we're never going to put our troops at risk, and sometimes we may have to make a hard call. But those considerations all go into what we do. We invest a heck of a lot of taxpayer money in precision weapon systems. In the times we were bombing Saddam when I was at CENTCOM, and you would hit a military target, you would find the Iraqis still driving up and down the streets. I saw videos of wedding parties while we were bombing. I said that was faith in American precision, and they didn't care who was getting bombed on the other side of the fence. And I know of no other nation in the world that takes the pains to do all that. But we have to understand that the mission comes first, as well as the protection of our troops. We will take into account collateral damage. We agonize over that, and we do it to a far greater extent than anyone else on this planet. We can't make decisions at levels high up above the firefight. We have to trust our junior leaders to make those kinds of decisions. They are trained to do it, and they have the capability, and they have the organization. We are getting to the point where we're trying to control the battlefield at levels far too high, and that with people that don't understand what is happening on the ground. And that's where we get into this problem.
So there's a couple of questions about Israel and asking about your suggestions of a strategy to deal with getting Islamic nations to coexist with each other and Israel, as well as does our relationship with Israel serve the United States well today?
Well, I think well, let me take the last part first. Our relationship with Israel is based on several things. Obviously, one, they are a democracy like we are. We have a special relationship with all democracies around the world. Obviously, there is an ethnic affinity with a large portion of our population with them. I think there's still even a sense of guilt over the Holocaust and our lack of attention and involvement in what happened down the road. So there are many reasons why that's a special relationship in that sense. It's a strange position that we get into is that both sides, and I did this mission, the Palestinians and the Israelis both realize there can only be one mediator, at least one mediator in charge, and that's the United States. They both recognize that, even given the special relationship. I think where the United States have failed is the process that we use. The special envoy sending somebody to go back and forth to do touch and goes, trying to solve the problem at a summit. The last one, Secretary Kerry said, well, we're going to do this in 9 months. You can't solve this problem in 9 months. I had suggested when I came back, form working groups. There's what's called the final status issues. Everybody has a different number. I had 10 final status issues. From the status of Jerusalem to right of return to borders to water rights, you name it. You need a working group made up of the Palestinians and the Israelis, Americans, and even others. There's what we call a quartet out there, the European Union, the UN, the Russia, and the United States. It should be a quintet. The Arab League should be involved. We should work on a work plan. You have to build it from the bottom up. We could paper the walls with agreements in principle. Both sides have signed them. They never get implemented because the devil's in the detail. You show the people exactly how it's going to work on the ground, what's going to happen, where the borders are, how we're going to administer those borders. You build it back up to the top for approval, not get an agreement in principle, and then that fuzziness never can get implemented. The second thing is you have to open up multiple channels. There is a channel for the formal negotiations. There needs to be a private channel. There are sticky issues that the very senior people need to be involved in. No, that does not exist today. There also needs to be what we call a track 2 in mediation. A track 2 is an unofficial channel. You bring in retired generals, retired diplomats, retired academics. They have no political position, no authority. They are free to float ideas and become creative. What I found in the process on both sides, I dealt with Sharon and Arafat, sometimes they would like to explore something, but they can't commit to it or even demonstrate that they're thinking about it because their own constituency might punish them for it, and they don't know how it might be received. Well, an unofficial channel allows for this free thinking, where you can float it out and see what the response is from the people on both sides. I think you need to look at some sort of monitoring regime that would have to be put in place on whatever agreements. And you also need to think about maybe implementing incrementally. You might be able to resolve borders first or right of return next. Why not decide and implement rather than try to eat the whole elephant in one bite? That might work in some sort of incremental way. The problem is nobody's being creative with this. Nobody's thinking through what the investment, and the investment is just in people and time to get everybody to do this. I've been involved in 8 mediation efforts around the world, from Africa to the Far East to the Middle East and elsewhere. This is the most complex of them all. And we keep trying to do it with send over a mediator, hold a summit, and in 2 months resolve this issue. It's not going to happen that way. And so I think we're in a position now with a weakened Palestinian fractured government situation, with the Israelis very much concerned about their own security, about what's going on all around them, and very defensive-minded, and maybe not apt to want to talk about these issues, with the continuing development of settlements, which is problematic and creates problems in terms of getting the negotiations going. But the only way this is going to happen is for some creative mediation efforts that are seen in a longer term and are more substantial and willing to establish themselves to work this out over a greater period of time, and as I said, in more creative ways.
One of the things you mentioned toward the end of your book is that you have a very strong feeling through the work that you've done in arbitration and mediation negotiation that we need a skilled core of professionals think most Americans believe that we have that in the Foreign Service Corps.
We don't.
Do we?
Look, I'm enrolled in a master's degree program now on conflict resolution. It scares my fellow students to see a 71-year-old student. And this has been done backwards because I've been involved in these mediations. I've worked with NGOs. I worked with the Henri Dunant Center in Geneva, the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, an organization called Intermediate in the United Kingdom. I've done it for our State Department, U.S. Institute of Peace. I've done special missions for the presidential missions in Pakistan and Africa and elsewhere. And after all that, now I'm going back to try to figure out what I should have known going into these. So it doesn't come with some sort of a blessing by being made a diplomat that you're automatically a mediator. Conflict resolution is a very complicated business. We've just recently now come to where a lot of our academic institutions are actually giving degrees in this and even advanced degrees. And I think we do, not just the United States. I would like to see us more active participating with international and regional groups that do this. There's some very good groups that work this, particularly sponsored by the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, and others, and the Swiss, even the United Kingdom and the Canadians. And I think we need to make a bigger investment in that. It's a hell of a lot better. As when I did this in Somalia and did the negotiations with General Adid and several others, I worked with Ambassador Bob Oakley, one of our finest diplomats that understood mediation, and he taught me one lesson. When they're talking, they're not shooting. So get them talking, which is a simple lesson, but it's very true.
Absolutely. And so one last question before we turn to our closing questions on mentoring, and that is, how do we get back to a more balanced use of all of our elements of national power and stop turning for everything to the military?
I think it's going to take several things. One, the Congress has to invest in the other agencies of government. We're out of kilter. We have a very big, we need a big military, I believe. Eisenhower, everybody quotes Eisenhower's speech about the military-industrial complex. Usually the people that quote it never read it, because he starts out by saying our arms must be mighty. But how do you make them mighty and know where to take risks because you can't afford everything? But more importantly, what I think you would hear now, I chair a committee as part of a global leadership conference of 150 retired 3- and 4-star admirals and generals. All of us in this committee are pushing Congress to provide the resources, the people, and the funding to the other agencies of government so that when we go into these situations, it doesn't all fall to the military. But it's beyond just money and people. I worked at a policy advisory group for then Senators Biden, Curry, and Lugar when they were on a Foreign Relations Committee to look at what we should do. And they didn't just want to throw money and people at this. The other agencies of government have to adopt some of the culture that the military has, like planning. We have, as I said, we have plans for everything. We need complementary plans. If we were to go to war with Korea, North Korea right now, we have a war plan. We do not have a plan for the aftermath. What will North Korea look like once it's devastated? What will a South Korea that will be greatly devastated? What's going to happen there? What kind of coalition and international support? What is our role there? We simply have military plans. I worked on a plan for Iraq while I was at CENTCOM, not to take down the regime and the Republican Guard. I knew we could do that in less than 3 weeks. I was more interested in the aftermath because of what I understood would happen if you popped the cork on Saddam. And we decided we needed 380,000 troops to seal the borders and to control the population once you took out the regime and the Republican Guard. But what we needed beyond that was who comes in now and fixes the political, the economic, the social problems, everything else that's in this mix now without the leadership. I went to State Department and elsewhere to get help and say, how about planning with us on this? No one was interested. It's not in their culture to plan. I went to USAID. I went everywhere. And when we decided to go into Iraq, I knew it was going to be a disaster because, first of all, it was the wrong war, wrong place, wrong time. Secondly, we were trying to do it with too few troops. We were going to unleash all the problems our intelligence had told us. The Sunnis would start killing Shia, the Shias would start killing Kurds and others, the borders would be porous since we didn't have enough troops, and bad things would come in, looting would occur to destroy the infrastructure, arms caches and ammo dumps would be looted, and God knows where that would all go. We predicted it all. And yet we had an administration that says, that's wrong. This will be a liberation, flowers in the street. This will be a cakewalk. You know, and remember when Colin Powell went to the United Nations and was able to get the inspectors back in, and we had the regime in, and they weren't finding WMD. We had a chance to walk this back, but we had a Secretary of Defense that said, well, our troops are already out there, and it's summertime, and it's hot in the desert, so we better use them. And they were to spend 10 more years sweating and bleeding in a desert as a result of that kind of cavalier attitude.
I wish I'd asked you a different question to end on before we go over to mentoring. That's not a very happy picture, sir, as we look at today's situation in the future. But in the interest of time, I did want to tap some of your leadership expertise since we are here with the Mentoring Alliance. In your book, you mentioned several of your mentors and so forth. Could you tell us why they were great mentors and what made them great mentors?
Well, I think the key to mentoring is that, and I'll tell you from someone who was mentored many times in my life and my career, somebody sees something in you that maybe you don't see in yourself. Somebody sees the potential. Somebody is willing to help you develop that potential. And you begin to realize you could not achieve that potential if you didn't have that belief in you. That's one part of mentoring. The other part of mentoring is all of us go through, especially as we're growing up and we go through our younger years and maybe early adulthood, there's things we've got to sort out. And where do you go to ask the questions? Where do you go to get the advice? Who do you lean on? If there's nobody within the family structure, if there's nobody within your work structure or wherever to do that, you're left with the business of trial and error. And more oftentimes it can be more error than it is success. So the mentor is one that allows you to believe in yourself. The mentor is one that is there to answer the questions that you have. Not necessarily have an answer, but they bring the wisdom of experience in life to help you understand at least how to resolve your own issues. The mentor is someone that you can look up to, in the case of the many senior officers I had, that were heroes, that you wanted to in some way model your life after. So there are many roles a mentor can play in someone's life. It is precious, I think, when someone reaches out, as we heard in the video, to say, maybe I didn't get it all right in the beginning when I had opportunities with my own kids or others, but I still have something to give and offer. And to find someone who's the sponge that can soak it up and need it, to me, that's what it's all about. There were several powerful mentors in my life that at times looked at me and said, you can be a hell of a lot better than you are right now. And they were able to show me how I could live up to that, or I wouldn't be here. But I do have one question. If I'm in Sonoma, why do I have water in my cup?
And my last question, we have some of the mentees who are with us tonight, and if I could ask them to please stand up. They're probably hiding. They're typical.
Jackie, right there.
Yeah, I know Jackie's here. She is. So, General, this is the next generation of our future leaders, whether it's in the business sector, our elected officials, professional government officials, or whether they choose to join the military. So what advice would you offer them?
I'm worried about our education system, especially at the primary level and the high school level. I'm worried for several reasons. I think I'm seeing too many young people not value the education, leaving school early. I've said often for the Chinese and the Indians and others that are potential competitors, and I don't mean in a warlike sense or military sense, but economic competitors, in terms of being powerful in many different ways, innovative, industry, business. They get it. They value education, and we're in an education competition. And we have seen to lose the value of education and being able to convince our young people of the value of that and the need to that and the importance there is for our nation in that education. One other thing I would say, I am really concerned about the fact that because school budgets are being cut, we are eliminating classes on civics and American history. And I don't mean, to me, civics and American history should equal citizenship. It's not teaching dates and facts in history. It's teaching things like the concepts this nation was built on, understanding the Constitution that we live under, understanding what we have in the way our government is structured, the way we vote, our freedom, our basic freedoms, especially speech and assembly and others that we should cherish. If we don't teach young people how they need to be involved and protect these and commit to these, if they don't understand what America is, if they're participate in the political process and know how to vote and how to address their congressman and how to express their views, I think we're in trouble down the road. So our education system has parts it needs to fix desperately. If we lose the education battle to others, we'll lose our power, we'll lose our innovation. I was the CEO of a $20 billion company, high tech. Even during the period in 2008 when the economy was collapsing and people were being laid off, we had a requirement for 1,100 engineers that we could never fill. And that scares me to think our nation couldn't produce in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, or any field, the requirements we need to retain our way of life and our well-being.
So thank you for your insights,
Thank you,
General. It's
Jody.
been a pleasure.
Thank you, General Zinni. Thank you, Vice Admiral Breckenridge. This was so enlightening. We really appreciate you being here, two distinguished and notable Americans right here in our midst, and thank you for all of your service.